Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Gold Coast Open House 2023. My name's Frances Greenman, and we're very delighted to have you all here this evening. Firstly, in the spirit of reconciliation, Gold Coast Open House acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Gold Coast Open House aims to engage the general public in dialogue with architects through the promotion of contemporary and historical architecture and design in our city. Our goal is to communicate the process of placemaking and highlight the range of professionals involved in the creation of the amazing spaces, places and buildings within our incredible Gold Coast city. We're a not-for-profit organisation and rely solely on volunteers and sponsors. Please support Gold Coast Open House by volunteering and sharing your experience of our event on social media with your friends. Before we begin, a few housekeeping matters. In the event of an emergency, please follow the exit signs and the direction of the HOTA staff. And can I please ask you all to turn your phones off at this stage? Tonight, we welcome you to the first of our two panel discussions for 2023. For the 2023 Gold Coast Open House event. Tonight's discussion is titled Housing Affordability, an Urgent Challenge. Our panel will discuss the issue of housing affordability, which is one that none of us could have missed, with extensive and ongoing coverage of it in the media. In fact, we welcome the ABC here tonight. They'll be covering the event with a piece on breakfast radio on Friday morning, so be sure to listen in, and also with a digital article. We note that tonight's discussion is being recorded. I'd like to introduce and warmly welcome our wonderful and varied panel of experts. The discussion is being led by David Ransom, who's sitting in the middle. Dave is an experienced planning professional with extensive experience in the government, consulting and development sectors, and has, in his role as a director of Zone Planning Group, given much thought to this topic. On the panel, we have Dan McKenna at the far end, the CEO of Nightingale Housing, a not-for-profit organisation delivering homes that are socially, financially and environmentally sustainable. With a background in architecture, Dan is passionate about increasing Nightingale's impact to deliver more quality, secure housing that's delightful to live in. Dr. Diaswati, Mardiasmo, who we'll call Asti tonight, is the Chief Economist of PRD Real Estate. Asti leads a nationwide research team providing property, housing and market research to the PRD franchises. Tonight, she brings her expertise in economics, public policy, demographics, housing data and supply of housing. Daniel Krause is an experienced town planner and managing director of Novium, the property services arm of social investment funder Turners Group. He's also a teaching fellow at Bond University. Fiona, last but not least, Fiona Caniglia, is the executive director of Q Shelter and a passionate advocate for housing and for the housing and homelessness sector. Fiona has postgraduate qualifications in social work and social planning and has extensive experience across government, community services and private industries. Fiona shares Q Shelter's vision of a home for every Queenslander. I will now hand you over to Dave to get the conversation started. But before I do, I'll let you know that at the end we'll be opening the discussion to the floor, and we hope you'll all have questions ready and comments to make.
Thanks, Frances. Is it on? Yep. Thanks, Frances. Thank you to Open House for taking an interest in this important topic. I didn't know that this was something that Open House covered, so I'm pleasantly surprised that it's a topic that everybody's interested in, and thank you for coming along tonight. So I figured it's fairly uncontroversial to suggest that we have a housing supply problem. It's in the media every day. There's a dwelling shortage nationally, a rental supply problem which feeds into affordability nationally. But this is a Gold Coast function, so I guess we want to try and drill into the Gold Coast as much as we can. And I figured it might be the best way to go would be to go from the broad to the specific and start off by sort of talking about what factors in particular have led the current situation to arise on the Gold Coast, and in particular the rental affordability issues we have here, dwelling supply problems. Just by way of an overview, it's just apparent that we're building a lot of apartment stock in this city for wealthy people. They're very expensive units, but virtually nothing affordable is being constructed. So rather than carry on with a statement, I might ask Asti if you could maybe give some overview as to any Gold Coast specific reasons or issues you can put your finger on as to why we have this situation happening in this city right now.
Thank you so much, and thank you Gold Coast Open House for having me, and for everyone to have made it out. I know that it was raining out there. I left Brisbane to come to this event at 3 p.m. and I've literally just arrived 2 minutes ago, so it took me 3 hours to drive in the rain. So thank you everyone for coming out, and thank you for all of the panelists for being here as well. When we talk about housing affordability, it's very easy to try and figure out or to try and pin it on one particular reason. And a lot of the times, the pinning of that reason is the cash rate, or the cash rate increasing, or higher interest rates, or the RBA increasing the cash rate. I'm not going to deny that, because like it or not, higher cash rates does impact the cost of living. It does impact our mortgages. It impacts a lot of things that we do, right? But when it comes to housing affordability and how we got to this stage, it depends on how you want your analogy. Sometimes I use the analogy of it's like an onion, and there's different layers in the property market, in government policy, in our economic system that has led us to this point of housing affordability. I don't like onions, so I prefer to look at it as a multi-layered cake, because I like cake better than I like onions. So for me, kind of like if you think of it as a layered cheesecake, then yes, the basis of it, that crumb, my preference is for Oreos, that crumb is the cash rate, right? So it does have that big, massive underpinning as to where we got to right now, because we all thought that we were going to have a steady, very low cash rate for a long time, because that was kind of what we were promised. And that didn't happen because inflation went up, and of course the RBA started increasing the cash rate. And not only did they increase the cash rate, they increased it literally month every month, and also not only 25 basis points, which is what they normally do, they did it by 50 basis points. So that's a shock to the system. That's a shock to our economic system that we've never had before. So yes, that Oreo cookie crumb base is kind of like your cash rate, but then on top of that, you also have different layers. You have construction challenges that we're facing right now, where there isn't enough people, there isn't enough labor to actually build houses. There is a very high construction cost anywhere across the board, even in the Gold Coast. Anywhere between 40 to 60% is the increase in construction cost, right? So that's one layer. The next layer up is the demographic moves, or the demographic challenges and the demographic shift. Because throughout COVID, Queensland received the biggest, highest net interstate migration that we've ever seen in the history of Queensland. And unfortunately, the way that Queensland planned their housing supply was not in anticipation to that big, massive interstate migration. We didn't expect that. We didn't plan for that. In fact, in most capital cities in Southeast Queensland, Gold Coast, Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, a lot of people thought that we had an oversupply of apartments in 2018 and in 2019. So we didn't plan for this sudden, big, massive move of people choosing Queensland as the place to live. So that's another layer of it. The third, well, how many layers have I got? 1, 2, 3. The fourth layer of it is government policy, whether it's from a federal perspective or a state local government perspective, and then the local council perspective. So from a state government perspective, there has been a lot of policies that stimulate the demand for property. If we look at first home buyer grants, regional home grants, single parent grants, any of the grants that stimulates first home buyers to be able to buy into the market, whether it's a 2% or a 5% deposit, that stimulates demand. Unfortunately, what the federal government has done is that they haven't stimulated supply, and even in the latest federal budget announcement, they've stimulated the build-to-rent sector, right? So they stimulated the ownership for demand, but they stimulated the rental for supply. And that's a policy mismatch. And if we look at the state and if we look at local council planning, there has also been some challenges on actually accurately projecting and looking at what is going to be the population projection and what type of housing is needed, how much housing is needed, and where is housing needed. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of different layers to what has led us to where we are right now and actually having this housing affordability crisis. The crux of it, from an economics perspective, it's all in the demand and supply. There's been a lot of stimulation from a demand perspective, whether it's government policy, whether it's more people moving into Queensland, whether it's the fact that after COVID, a lot of people had about 25% of savings. All of that stimulates demand. But the stimulation from the supply side has been lacking. And so at the very crux of it, it's that. But if you kind of peel it back to all those different layers on your cake, there's all of these different things that does make up to the whole context of why we are where we're at right now. So I'd love to be able to point like my finger at this. It's just this one thing that we need to solve. But the reason why housing affordability in academic circles is called a wicked problem is because there's so many different multiple layers to it that trying to solve it is kind of like you have to solve every single layer before having the whole cake being yummy again, so to speak.
Very good. I know a guy who likes yummy cake, and that's Dan Krause. And what I was going to ask Dan is, Dan has intimate knowledge of dwelling supply on the Gold Coast, and I just wanted to ask Dan, are there particular issues on the Gold Coast that affect dwelling supply that tie in with what Asti was just talking about?
Yeah, sure, Dave. I suppose part of what leads into that is what land do we actually have available in the first place to actually be able to develop. And part of, I suppose, the thing that as a region more broadly throughout southeast Queensland that we have to deal with is a restriction around where urban development occurs and where it doesn't. Sitting underneath the urban footprint, looking at the Southeast Queensland Regional Plan, which defines our urban footprint boundaries. That sets a hard edge for where development can and can't occur. The mix of development, whether it be greenfield, as in vacant land that's being converted across for some sort of suburban or urban use, or infill development. In places like the Gold Coast here, there is a larger focus on urban consolidation, which is using our existing urban areas and not facilitating a huge amount more of greenfield development. The target there at the moment is about an 80-20 split, 80% being infill, 20% being greenfield, roughly speaking. Across the whole region of Southeast Queensland, the latest version of the draft Southeast Queensland Regional Plan talks to a 70-30 split, being a much greater focus now towards urban consolidation throughout the entire region, and leaving a lot of the greenfield areas in locations that are further away from services and need a lot more investment in order to actually facilitate greater densities and so forth, and a more livable and active kind of urban community outcome. Here on the Gold Coast, part of that greater emphasis then on urban consolidation brings with it how do we actually develop in our urban areas. A lot of the parts of the city that are zoned for medium and higher intensity housing have already historically been developed for multiple unit developments, whether they be townhouses or apartment buildings, which brings with it issues around things like existing strata titling arrangements and the need to acquire currently 100% of those units in order to dissolve a body corporate. I know there's talk of amending that legislation to bring that down to around a 75% margin, which helps things along but isn't necessarily a solution to everything. And then on the greenfield space, which is traditionally, I suppose, where we see more of our affordable product in a way, that's more of our first homeowners, those types of markets. Here on the coast, that land that's available is pretty close to being dried up. What's left that is zoned for, say, suburban residential development to be cut up into residential lots is typically heavily constrained, whether that be by things like flooding or koala habitat or other natural hazards issues, landslide hazard and things like that. That means that while a planning scheme might envisage a higher density outcome, so you might have a hectare parcel of land, zone medium density residential, but when you start looking at, and in theory the planning scheme allows for say 100 lots on that particular block, when you start looking at all those different constraints around flooding, environmental matters and so forth, that can easily whittle that number back down to one or nothing at all, which means that those few parcels that are left out there that in theory could be redeveloped really have very little to no development potential that adds further pressure on what supply we can actually deliver in that space.
Great, thank you, Dan. Fiona, I just wanted to ask you, what challenges do you see in providing affordable housing for low and middle income earners in our community? I know you cover more than the Gold Coast, but if you've got a Gold Coast aspect to offer?
Well, we know that there's a shortfall of social and affordable homes on the Gold Coast. I think the most recent research I've looked at is it's about a shortfall of about 8,000 homes, and the rate at which Queensland is building social and affordable homes is nowhere near that for the whole state. So it's a colossal problem, not just in the Gold Coast, but elsewhere. I do want to say that I think Q Shelter as a peak organisation has evolved in its thinking. We've come to really understand that while we might have a particular concern for social and affordable housing supply, which is really important, that to be able to supply that part of the market effectively, we need a healthy housing system where there is enough supply to meet demand. And, it's been a great concern to us that there is a pipeline of people surging towards the need for social and affordable homes because the broader housing system does not have a healthy relationship between supply and demand. And that's an unsustainable position because of, a huge number of market constraints at the moment that we're facing in terms of costs of construction and supply chain issues, etc. But it's also unsustainable in any other kind of time period that you might sort of consider. So for us, getting that equation of the right supply to meet demand with really solid long-term population-based planning, so that we do have a pipeline of homes that can meet population needs at the same time as we're preventing people from surging towards really high-cost, high-subsidy products. And I think that's really important, that it's not just about sitting at the edge at the bottom of the cliff and trying to catch everybody who's falling off it. And the lowest 40% of the income spectrum would traditionally be Q Shelter's concern, but we're seeing people in the third and fourth income quintiles struggling with home ownership. It just doesn't work anymore with the cost of homes. So there's just also an increasing pool of people who are facing lifelong renting, who probably won't easily enter into home ownership. So there's just also a question for us about the broader affordability of homes and making sure that that we're thinking really deeply about the fact that people need security of tenure, they need a long-term home, a proposition where they can live as long as they want to, wherever they are. The cost of moving is significant. So, yes, we're primarily concerned with the lowest two quintiles in terms of income spectrum, but that third and fourth quintile are the people who are also really struggling. So this broader universalisation of the housing struggle, I think, is both a serious threat but also a real opportunity to build a very clear and strong and sustained mandate for the kinds of changes we need to see.
Great, thanks Fiona. I was just going to ask the other Dan, we have two here tonight, with regard to the Nightingale housing model that you've adopted. I've been to a couple of conferences where someone very impressive has explained exactly what you do predominantly in Melbourne, in sort of low-rise apartment territory. Could you just explain what you do differently to make it affordable, and how you could possibly implement that in this city if you wanted to?
Yeah. Thanks very much for having me and being part of this conversation up here. It's really, really great to get out of our bubble in Melbourne. Obviously, Nightingale's a Victorian-based not-for-profit housing developer, and we build community-focused, sustainable homes. I also live in one of those buildings as well. There's 20% allocation to community housing providers in our buildings, so that's how we ensure real diversity and real mixed tenure in our buildings. So that's social and affordable housing embedded within our communities. For us, we aren't a government body. We don't operate through subsidised grants and things like that. So we're out there in the open market buying pieces of land next to people with much deeper pockets. And so we have to be really creative and very diligent about what we do build and what we don't build. And so for us, tying into our ideas around sustainability, it's about reductionism and it's about pulling things out. And so we've sort of started this, kicking this around about 10 years ago, and it was a group of architects who started Nightingale. I'm trained as an architect. It was all about architecture, and it was all about pulling things out, bring the cost down, curating it beautifully and giving people homes that they could live in forever. And as we shifted from design as the solution and becoming full-scale developers, we quickly realised that it was finance and it was sales and it was community engagement. It was so much more. And so now Nightingale as an organisation is much, much bigger. We've gone from 20 apartments we delivered in 2017 to just over 1,000 apartments across the country. So not just Victoria. So we've got built projects in WA, South Australia and New South Wales, just about to finish. Nothing in Queensland, hence why I'm here. I'm really keen to continue to branch out and understand the problems that aren't just happening in Brisbane, it's happening in the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. And the narrative in the national media is very, very clear that housing is the number one problem, I think, that we see. Obviously, it's front of mind for us. What we've done and what we've shown in Melbourne, we've shown that it can work in regional cities. In Victoria, there's a huge appetite for it. So it was a bit of a test case, 5, 6, 7 years ago when we started, and we've had massive oversubscriptions in all of our buildings and all of our projects all across the country. So we're super keen to engage with different communities, engage with different industry partners to bring that across the country.
Very good, thank you. Another question for Asti. So Dan mentioned the South East Queensland Regional Plan before, and it says that they anticipate 158,100 new dwellings in this city to the year 2046. I forget what the estimated population that accommodates is, but more than 1 million people. So we're talking about a very rapidly growing city with an almost exclusively consolidation focus. And I just wanted to ask from an economics perspective, how realistic is it that we're going to accommodate that growth in towers, considering the cost of concrete, glass, steel, unionised labour, and we have 2 tier 1 builders in this city, and not every middle tier builder is sort of regarded confidently in terms of construction projects?
It's always hard talking about realities, and one of the things that I did consult with the state government when it comes to the SEQRP, or the South East Queensland Regional Plan, is the what I would say almost the non-existent consideration as to who would actually be able to deliver these targets, right? Because even at the moment, and we did the research on this, out of all of the residential construction that does have an approval and a confirmed status in the Gold Coast, about half of them don't have builders. And this is the reality of it right now. We're not even talking about the reality of it in the next year or the 2 year or whenever it is that the South East Queensland Regional Plan is actually going to come into effect, right? We're just talking about the realities right now. The availability of labour is very much so constrained and very much so minimal that, and I don't know, Other Dan, I'm going to call you Other Dan now, Other Dan, if you've seen this, but there is a rise at the moment for developers not to just be developers, but actually developer-builder sort of like team, and having an in-house builder team to kind of like secure if this is what we want to do as a developer, that we can actually then build it and deliver it, right? So there is that very painful reality, not only from a construction cost perspective, which is what you've said, but even if you can find a way to cover that construction cost, finding the people who will actually build it is a challenge in itself. And so I had 2 criticisms of three actually, because I just like to pile it on, right? Number one is kind of, your Other Dan, so the first Dan, have said about the original Dan, have said about the actual accuracy of data, where they've said that there is about 1,000 odd hectares available of land, but really if we scale back on what is actually developable, it's not 1,000 hectares, right? And if I look at the population projection for Gold Coast, there's going to be about an extra 150,000 people coming into this beautiful city, and we don't have enough dwellings. We need about 60,000 dwellings in the next 10 years. So there's a bit of a mismatch in data for the SEQRP in terms of their projections for the Gold Coast. That's number one. That was my first criticism, and that's why I'm so big on data and accuracy of data. The second one is that consideration for the ability of builders, local capacity of local builders to actually be able to deliver what is being promised. And the third part that I had was the SEQRP at the moment is at a stage where it relies a lot on local councils being able to create an implementation plan of the plan, if you can follow that, and then for the state government to approve of that plan to actually be able to deliver housing. So it's very much so kind of like a push into local council, we've kind of given you this big, massive target. Now we're going to push it out to you to try and figure it out, to try and kind of figure out the steps. And this is what you're going to do. This is what the targets are. How are you going to do it? And then we'll circle back and then approve it. And for me, by the time that whole circle has happened, there would be more of a focus on the 3rd and 4th quintile, like what you said, Fiona, because then that means that time has passed where there will be people who don't have access to the housing. So in terms of how realistic it is, it's
Not realistic?
My Little Pony world realistic, I'd say, right? In the sense that there are some parts of it that still needs to be dug deeply even more into the accuracy, and then how, because I'm all about execution, how is it actually going to be executed?
Thank you. Another question for you, original Dan. So we just spoke about, you're very familiar with the lodgement of development applications and the process for gaining approval for or permission to undertake developments. But it seems as though the areas that we need to consolidate or are encouraged to consolidate under the SEQRP, I guess, are occupied by existing people who might not share those views. So what sort of challenges do you think that sort of poses in the consolidation process?
Lots. Lots of challenges. And I suppose the term that gets thrown around for a lot of that pushback, if you like, is NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And it stems, I suppose, a little bit from fear of change in some respects. Going from a neighbourhood that might currently be predominantly detached housing, suddenly zoned medium density residential, and you can build low-rise apartments or townhouses there. So your population's double, tripling, quadrupling potentially under a planning scheme, and that rate of change in times like this where there is demand for that missing middle type of product, as we'd call it, means that change is happening a lot quicker than what some people might be expecting. And with that comes a lot of angst from community, pushback, particularly irrespective of whether you've got a development application that's code accessible and requires public notification, or impact accessible and needs to go through that public notification process, and people can formally have their say, lodge submissions for or against an application. What we're finding, and as you know, Dave, particularly there's some hotspots around the city where any type of development is getting a lot of interest from the community, whether it be positive or negative. And that filters through the whole decision-making process, whether that be through to council officer level or through to the political arm of council. And that causes issues along the way with how that development process is actually undertaken and the outcome that might be achieved at the end of the day. It does, with that heightened interest as well, increase the risk profile for impact accessible applications, where you go through that notification process and anybody who makes a properly made submission gets submitter appeal rights. We're probably seeing at the moment, from what I understand, that one of the highest rates of submitter appeals that we've seen in a long time, which puts extra pressure on the development side of things, from cost and time to go through that legal process through the Planning and Environment Court, and means that you end up with delays on projects if they ultimately get approved again by the court, or causes issues along the way where things might, the court might find in a submitter's favour or an appellant's favour and overturn an approval to a refusal, which then generates issues from a planning consultancy and a development assessment perspective around, are we making the right decisions in interpreting planning schemes the way that we might actually be meant to? So I suppose all this extra interest, it's good that people are interested in the whole development process, but it does cause some issues with that delivery side of things. And I think, putting my developer hat on now, going from a planning side to a developer side, that is almost, there is a role for planners and there's a role for developers to some respect as well in educating the community. I know through the Planning Institute of Australia we talk about how can we educate the community around planning the process, what the planning scheme means and things like that, and how development is intended to occur, some of the pros, some of the cons, things like that. And it's a bit of a, I suppose, a conundrum that we've struggled with for a long time. And I don't think we're any closer to really solving how we deal with that issue as a profession. But it's something that's becoming more and more of an issue and a lot higher priority, I think, that we as planners need to actually deal with.
Very good. Thank you, Dan. Fiona, when I spoke to you the other day, you had this term I hadn't heard before, wow and now. Wow being the big glitzy, from what I gather, the big glitzy towers as a housing solution, and the now meaning how do you actually house people, provide a roof over their head immediately, and I presume we're referring to those with the lowest financial means in the city have perhaps been pushed out of the back end of the rental market, or those who just simply cannot find housing in the city. And again, not to make this a statement, it is a question, but from what I've seen in this city, we're getting 15,000 people a year moving to the Gold Coast recently, and they're not moving here to be homeless. They have money and they're buying property and finding rentals and that sort of stuff. So it would appear that it's local low-income people being pushed out the back end of the process, and that means living in cars, living in tents, living in camper vans, that type of thing. What are some of your ideas as to? I told you there'd be a question. What are some of the ideas you have about the now? Delivering housing now.
Look, I think the now is a really tough proposition. I've been a privileged to be part of the Queensland Housing Roundtable and the Summit, and I think there is now dozens of complementary activities underway which will make a difference. They really will. And I like to say that to my sector in a great lot of detail about what all of those things are, because they're battling away at the front line trying to help people who have nowhere to live at all. So I commend the state government for the summit and the roundtable. And the now and the wow was really the wow being the medium to long term, that we solve it, which is going to take time, and that all of the constraints that have been discussed tonight I acknowledge. But the now proposition is what is really tough. So, we've taken a great deal of interest. In fact, I took a call today from, modular home builders, really high quality products. I think we need modern methods of construction to come into play. Now, the state government does have an initiative as a result of the summit, which is focused on this, which is really positive. And I've seen those products and I think they're fantastic homes. But we need those types of homes to be generated at scale and with speed. And I think the framework we've got isn't right. I think it's such a crisis for the people who don't have a home and who face displacement, where you have not enough homes and a surging demand from people. Someone has to go, and it is the people on lower incomes who have poorer opportunities and ability to compete in such a tough market. I think the framework we need is one that Queensland really knows and understands well. Queensland performs incredibly well in disaster management and recovery, right? We know, like, if a storm swept through Queensland and took out 150,000 homes, which it could, a storm system, what would we do? We would have such a different mindset. So, I think this piece about not in my backyard, when you have a home and you're saying other people shouldn't have a home, I do have a fundamental problem with it. And it's in fact a trend or a set of behaviours I've observed since the very early part of my career. A 400-odd angry mob turning up onto public housing sites, demanding they be sold when I lived in Sandgate, Shorncliffe, where I grew up. And then some of the properties at that time under a particular government were sold, and other, building density was reduced as a result of community pressure. So I think we've got a fundamental problem that the voices of people who don't have a home are not embedded in the system, in the structures. They don't have loud voices. They're too busy trying to survive. Where will I move my tent to tomorrow? But the organised opposition to housing density and diversity is a material issue. It's also really important that politicians have a mandate. So it's not just that you don't want to hear those voices against certain types of homes. It's that we need politicians to really feel and know that they have a mandate to build more homes, to build more diverse homes to meet emerging population needs. For example, we need smaller homes. The percentage point difference in household size has driven the need for tens of thousands more homes in Queensland. That's another population-based thing that we're all driving by how we live and who we live with. So we need to be able to establish for politicians that there is a mandate to work in this way. And a slight provocation, and I hear what Asti's saying about the South East Queensland Regional Plan pushing responsibilities onto local government. I think there is a really vital role. Local governments have to interpret this through planning schemes, right? We can do everything else, but the planning scheme level is a very, very important level. But I am really working as hard as I can through my organisation and through partnerships with people like Amy Degenhart and other private sector peak bodies to end the narrative that there's a competition between levels of government and there's conflict. We actually need them to back each other in. when it comes to housing density and diversity. We don't want to see different tiers of government taking the opportunity to perhaps prevail over another tier of government around a development or a site or a building. We need them all shoulder to shoulder to back in the fact that there is nowhere to go community with a push to reduce the number of homes that are coming into the pipeline because you just can't deal with change. That's not to say I don't think we need a careful, considered approach to change, and I'm sitting around the table with a huge initiative of the state government to really address this very issue. But what we need to do is foster a better together mentality, that there's if this was a war or a massive hit to 150,000 homes through a storm cell in Queensland, we'd see people drawing together. There's no place for a narrative that pits us against one another. I've never seen anything like housing to need a system-wide approach with deep relationships, deep respect, and deep commitment to being colleagues rather than competitors.
Great answer, really good. Other Dan, I'm just, if you've followed my pattern so far, I'm being very, there's a lot of quality in the question asking sequence here today.
Yeah.
So it'll probably fall a bit soon, but anyway, we'll stick with it for the time being. So in Canberra, we recently saw the federal government basically say we're going to set aside $10 billion and we're going to put it in a fund, and the interest it earns we're going to put into public housing. And then the Greens came out and said that, well, they said two things. One is we'll only sign that off in the Senate if you agree to a rental cap. And the second thing was that's not enough money, you need to increase the amount of money. And the rental cap thing didn't happen, but the increased amount of money did happen. But the prevailing perception seemed to be that government alone can solve the housing problem, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that. Can government alone solve this problem?
No, I think it's gotten super hot and super political very, very quickly, and that we say that at the national level, state level in Victoria, and at the local level, and it's really, really difficult for us in the industry doing our absolute best, but not really knowing what 3 months, 6 months, 3 years is going to look like in terms of funding. Like, we have to make decisions today to buy sites, to hire staff, to lay staff off when there's so many things kicking around in the media, and it's very difficult to understand what's real and what's not. I'm, deeply philosophically aligned with what the Greens are pushing for, but in the same breath, I'm here to take action, here to build stuff, and here to deliver. And we need to move quickly, because I think people that work in the industry understand the decisions we make now. It's probably 4 to 5 years before people are sleeping in beds that we've drawn on a bit of paper today. So the slower we go, the harder it is, and the worse the problems are going to be. So I think, the more money the better, the more support the better. It's a really, really interesting political climate in Victoria at the moment. The last couple of weeks, the state government, Dan Andrews, has just released his big housing plan, which has a lot of really, really big, bold statements and a lot of numbers. And so we were crunching the numbers. You were talking about stats before, and one of the media articles the next day summarised it hilariously in saying that Dan Andrews needs to build 220 homes a day for the next 10 years. And we saw that and we're like, oh my God, how's that going to work? And it's like every big political statement. It's like no one's gotten to that level. Well, and then a week later he's no longer there. So it's there's a lot of tension between the state government and the local government. I was at a council meeting, Marybeth Council meeting last night until the early hours, going back and forth with councillors voting on one of our new projects, which is 282 homes and 15% affordable housing. And we had some really fierce opposition on the affordable housing provision, not from where you would think politically in the chamber, but actually from the deep left side of the chamber saying, well, this isn't enough. This needs to be 100%. This needs to be this needs to be in perpetuity. And it's not the forum for us to be educating or engaging or talking through the economics behind how it all has to come together to actually deliver one affordable housing unit. And it was kind of painful to have to sit there through that process and not necessarily have a voice in that chamber to be able to sort of talk about, yes, I agree with you, I want this to be 100% affordable, I want this to be in perpetuity, I want everybody to have a roof over their head, but these are the rules that are in front of us right now. We're playing within those rules and we're doing our absolute best, and we don't have to be doing this. We're doing this because we think we should be doing this, and we've shown that it works. And, you know, we look like self-interested developers turning up, trying to push things through, when in actual fact we're actually trying to fight for the people who don't have a voice yet, because they don't exist yet. They don't know that this is their home yet. So, yeah, it's a really interesting time. There's a lot of support, there's a lot of opposition, there's just a lot of focus and a lot of heat in the conversation, which ultimately is a good thing, because everybody now understands how significant the housing crisis is, and any new steps, any innovation is welcome.
It's probably a good tie into the concept of inclusionary zoning. I think that's the term. But it's something that is written in the South East Queensland Regional Plan again, and this is leading to a question to you, Dan, by the way, original Dan. As I understand it, it's a notion of, you mentioned 15%. It's the provision of a proportion of affordable housing, whatever that is, within a standard development as a means of delivering an affordable supply of housing in the community. So, Dan, I was going to ask you about that concept. Do you think that'll work? Because viability has to be obtained, which I think is what your point was at the end of the day, was unless you achieve economic viability, nothing happens, really.
Yeah, look, I think it has the potential to work as a concept, and it works in other places other than Queensland, around the world. But I think in balancing up the economic side of things, because of course as a private sector developer is always going to still look at the bottom line at the end of the day. They're not going to deliver a project where if they have to dedicate 25-30%, say, for affordable housing at turning out to be, say, at less than market rate that they might be able to achieve for if it was provided at the same standard as all the other product in their development, and that knocks the margins out, they're not going to deliver that, and that's going to potentially have flow-on effects for how we deliver supply just generally across the board. So that's, I suppose, a bit of an example of how it kind of can't be used as a stick in a way. I think you've used that term before. Stick and a carrot. The opposite end, using it as a carrot as a bit of an incentive for a developer, where you provide 10-15% of your apartment stock for affordable housing, and there's some sort of incentive that goes with it. It's an increase in density, building height, floor space ratio, something like that, that is used as a bit of a bonus in order to deliver that percentage of affordable stock and try to hit that sweet spot where viability of the overall project is still maintained across the board. That might have scope.
Francis is lurking here, so I better give you a microphone.
To put a stop to it, but I do want to give the audience a chance to ask their questions and say what they have to say. If anybody has something to ask.
Thank you. I heard Dan, number one, say a while back about the need to educate the public, and you weren't sure how to do that. And I would say community consultation is something that's needed, and it can be done. I think you'll find a lot of people will be very keen and will want to get involved in that. And I think the other thing is NIMBYism is a factor, but a lot of people are very keen on this missing middle, that middle-size range of development, townhouses too, and looking at the influx of people into this state. A lot of them are coming with young children, and these big high-rises that tend to be luxury ones clustering on the coast are often not affordable or suitable for young families, and we've got this other sort of development, the detached dwellings, acres of them in places like Pimpamar, and there seems to be nothing in between. It's this very big difference, and we've got a younger demographic in one bit, an older demographic in another. How can we get more of the missing middle, and can we get some more community consultation, please?
Yeah, nice. Simple. The community consultation side of things, sure, it certainly is part of that whole education process and taking community on the journey. I know firsthand that's part of one of the projects that I've worked with in the past with Bond over in the Solomon Islands, where the community we've adopted there, we've taken them on the journey from day one. No one knew what planning was, no one knew how to facilitate, or no one had been shown how to facilitate development in a way that works well for everyone, and taking them on the journey from that point on to the point where we helped them to develop their own plan that reflected what they wanted, and they're now in a position to be able to implement themselves. We took it from a community where there was no planners at all through to government employing, I think, 3 planners at the start of 2020. So it's an example of community consultations, part of that process for sure, that works well and has the ability to take community on the journey. Consultation needs to be done in a manner that does take people on the journey though. Public notification is a basic sort of process for development that anyone doing an impact assessable DA in Queensland has to follow, is really just informing. There's not a lot of listening that goes on. Even the mandatory consultation processes that go on when we're drafting planning instruments, whether it be state government or local government, there's still, I suppose, a notion that it just has to be done, not that we actually have to listen and take on board a lot of that feedback. So consultation in partnership with actually taking some of that feedback on board and taking people on the journey is part of that education piece for sure. Missing middle. I would tend to say that Gold Coast probably does missing middle to an extent better than other locations around Queensland. We have a lot of areas of the city through, say, Palm Beach, parts of Burleigh, up the coastal spine, where you get the kind of the gradation in a way from the high rise through to the middle, through to suburbia, typically further along to the west past Bermuda Street in a way, or to the western side of the Nerang River as a bit of a guide. That middle part there, where it's generally zoned to facilitate more low medium density outcomes, is kind of a bit of a case study where I think a lot of the product that's being delivered now and has been over the last few years has been hitting that mark. It's probably still at a slightly higher price point than what a lot of the market really needs. But we're also, you look at the other parts of the city that facilitate more housing product that is in that what we'll call affordable range, Pimpamar, Ormo, Oxenford, they're at a point where a lot of that stock's already been delivered in the last 10 years at detached dwelling kind of scale. So there's not a lot of scope for redevelopment yet. It's not at the end of its useful life, which means that it's probably still a fair way down the track until we see product in those areas becoming that same sort of missing middle scale, low medium density. So the affordability aspect, and whether even then converting that to, say, a detached house in Pimpamar to 4 townhouses, whether that's still affordable on a build cost and the land cost, is probably still a bit questionable as well. So, yeah, I think overall, Gold Coast probably does it better than some other places around southeast Queensland and the state more generally. But yeah, there's a lot of factors at play that drive whether that's still affordable or not.
Can I just interject with that one? With the community consultation, and I just want to get a feel here, because I'm one of those people, right? Who here have actually or have whether it's read the full or the summary or the highlights of the Southeast Queensland Regional Plan and have actually provided any comments to it? Hands up. Awesome. You're not supposed to put your hands up. I was talking to the audience, right? The reason why I asked this is because something when I get briefed on it, that was the first question that I asked. I said, so what does the community consultation look like? How many times is it being done? Because the one thing, and it kind of links back to what you're talking about density, with the Southeast Queensland Regional Plan, the one thing that they are really pushing is the concept of gentle density, which is basically that sort of move from detached housing to a more townhouse or a more unit terrace housing or even an apartment. So the term there is gentle density. And the one thing that I did say was, have you consulted people about this, the community about this, particularly their sentiment about whether or not that they do welcome gentle density? The answer was yes, and they did give me all the different dates of when it's happened and, you know, where it's happened, and I commend them for that, because I can see that it's about a 30-40% increase than any previous sort of like planning that they've done. But the one thing that I am interested in is I want people's feedback on this actually, is what do you believe will need to be done for those sort of plans to be more accessible, for people to actually, you know, be in it and want to give that consultation and actually actively be part of that consultation? Like, what sort of feedback can we give? Because I know that all four of us talk to local government officials quite regularly and also state government officials. This is where we're asking, you know, like, what can they do to make these documents more accessible or, you know, involve the community more in terms of consultation? I'd love to be able to chat about that from the community's perspective so that we can double feedback loop that to state governments and local councils.
So is there anybody here who might like to answer that?
I've got a contrarian view. I'm a builder developer, and I listened to Fiona talking about, you know, to get better together and now the now bit. I'm a developer doing development now, and the impediment to allow me to build a diverse and connected community in a village sense is our planning scheme and the way in which the systems work. And, you know, housing affordability is not just a Gold Coast issue, it's not just an Australian issue, it's an international issue all over the globe. And if you look at other examples, for example, in England and New Zealand, and just recently the recently retired Premier of Victoria, unfortunately, if you go on with community consultation ad nauseum, you will never have a now. The reason we're at the position we are at now is because that's all we do. We don't act. And so sometimes solutions to these sort of problems, for example, a catastrophe or a war, you do need a benevolent dictator. And you do need people to make decisions. In Victoria, they only did it a couple of weeks ago. They made changes which mandate the ability to do gentle density or infill housing, and the public have had an opportunity over many years to have a say. Elected officials have to govern at the end of the day. And so that's what, in my opinion, happened. So do you honestly believe, any of you speakers, that if we continually consult and consult and consult, we're ever going to end up with a better answer than actually doing some action? And the Planning Minister under our Planning Act has the ability, as I understand it, to make a decision tomorrow by way of a ministerial fiat to change the whole system, and we can actually provide housing for a whole lot of people and address all the missing needs that we have. What do you think?
Oh, look, you know, I appreciate the provocation because, you know, I think when I think about the members and stakeholders we have from community housing providers and specialist homelessness services, as well as a whole range of interested individuals for those people facing that demand and for those people who are fronting services, they may or may not get any assistance because the demand has grown so much. So when I think about community consultation, look, I think it's a very important thing, but I also think that we need a planning system that takes account of the diversity of interests, and not everybody's going to be able to come to the table in a consultation process, make their views known and run through that contest and have those views prevail. So I think I agree with you that government needs to step in right now and enable planning and construction and development and enough homes in the pipeline. That's not to say, and I think that's the now proposition because this is a crisis, right? The wow proposition is not so much for me about consultation, because I think that's a pretty low order element in an engagement plan. True engagement will take a deeper approach to dialogue over the longer term to help the community understand and embrace the need for smaller homes, for more diverse homes. Certainly gentle density, absolutely, but also, you know, to lay the foundations for the capacity to build, you know, greater density in more locations in a consolidated form of urban, you know, environment, so that we're not sprawling out where the poor people go and where the infrastructure doesn't go for years and years and years until there's crises like crime, etc. So I'm going to say no to lots more consultation. I'm going to say yes to a longer term, deeper process of change with the community to help people embrace the diversity and the density that we need. And in the immediate term, I think we need planning schemes that enable a lot more types of homes to be developed without as much fuss. To your point earlier about there are supporters out there, I agree with that. And part of the longer term change process is to find those supporters and build those relationships, because we're always only dealing with the opposition. My sector deals with the opposition before they plan for where they're going to find the supporters, like so many of you. So, yeah, less consultation right now, more command and control, to be honest.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to hand the microphone to Amy.
I'll make it so quick, maybe there's time for two. Asti, I wonder if from an economic point of view, valuations and loans and that whole regime, whether there's a way that we can tweak the levers to get more small dwellings.
From an economic perspective, the answer is yes, because there's a lot of ways that from an economic perspective that we can do, whether it's less taxes, whether it's less infrastructure costs, whether it's less bureaucratic tape so that planning schemes or, you know, even plans can go further much quicker and can be approved much quicker, whether it's contribution from both government and industry when it comes to creating small dwellings, whether it's a change in the laws so that the definition of small dwellings can be a little bit more defined, and also the ability for any lots or land sizes or land use to be transferred or changed quickly. So from a textbook perspective, yes. But the realities of actually making those textbook changes happen, that's the part that we're struggling with right now, because A, I agree to a certain extent that there is a lack of command and control. B, in terms of how it's delivered throughout the whole of Australia, the local councils have a very decentralised government system, in the sense that local councils can make a lot of their own planning schemes. They can charge different types of taxes. They can have different kinds of incentives, right? So to try and uniform that across all of the different local councils is a challenge, and each local council also have a different capacity and capability of actually making these decisions. So it's a little bit of a yes and no, from a yes technically and a no in terms of challenges of how to actually create it. Because a lot of my developer friends, they come to me and they say, well, I can develop in this local council because they've got X, Y, Z provisions. But if I go over to the next suburb, which actually belongs to a different council, then I'm actually being faced with other type of charges. Now, I don't develop to this scale that both Dan's, original and other Dan, do. But I know that when I was about to build my properties, I had to choose whether I would build in a particular street that belongs to the Newcastle Council or another street, and by there that belongs to the Lake Macquarie Council. Because even within those two very neighbouring councils, there's different systems and different incentives that I could access. And so from a textbook perspective, yes, and you guys probably have different, other views on this or, similar views. But the realities of it is that there are competing interests within just different councils. Do you have something to add, other Dan?
Very quickly on that, we had to fight really, really hard to implement what we call a tile house apartment, otherwise known as a studio apartment in other parts of the world, because studio makes people feel a bit sick because of what we've seen in the past. Tile house is a German word meaning part of house, and we design our entire buildings as your entire home, your gardens on your rooftop and everything like that. But importantly, we had to fight through council to get people to understand what this actually was and what design quality actually does for people living in small footprint homes at 27 to 35 square metres. And we had to work with banks to make them understand what this was. And this was like 2018, 2019 era. We sold them the starting price for this, the lowest prices were $215,000 and they went up to $295,000. I've been in rooms with single women over 55 in tears signing their contracts saying, I'm sleeping in my car. I didn't think that this would be ever possible, that I would have a safe, secure home, that I'm set for the rest of my life. It's a game changer, and we're trying to actually do it to show the rest of the industry, the development industry, that you can do it tastefully and you can actually sell it at cost, and this is what it costs.
Thank you. One last question. Anybody? Yes.
This was one for Asti, really. I guess it's you said you like data and reliability of data, and we've talked a lot about population projections and estimates and the continuing growth of in-migration to the Gold Coast. Do you think, one thing that always intrigues me is if the housing situation continues to be as bad as it is, are people still going to move here, or is that going to tail off? Or are we going to see the polarisation that Fiona talked about, that the only people that can really afford to move to the Gold Coast are people who can afford an upmarket, well-designed, well-built beachfront apartment, and the young families are going to be on the fringes and possibly in a place that actually isn't the Gold Coast. They're going to be in Logan. So they're attracted by the Gold Coast lifestyle.
Yeah.
But they're not going to be anywhere near it, and because of congestion, getting from Beanley to the Spit on a Sunday lunchtime is going to be a challenge that they might just give up on. So is that, so are people going to change their behaviour like rational actors and go, I just won't come there anymore?
I love that you have a very specific example of going from Beanley to the Spit on a Sunday afternoon. Sounds like it's something that you do quite a lot. The one thing that I will say when it comes to data is population growth and population demographic shift changes, all of that. A lot of it is underpinned by data from the Treasury, whether it's federal Treasury, whether it's state Treasury, and then it then flows onto like different state departments and also flows into different local councils. A lot of the time, the data when it comes to population projections from Treasury is actually under forecasting, in the sense that they project that it might be a certain amount, but it's actually about 10-20% lower. And that's actually kind of something that got us into trouble in the first time, because those projections are inaccurate in the sense that it's under projecting, then state governments and local councils did not plan for enough houses. In terms of the Queensland projection for population growth, it has been revised in the past 6 months to it being not going up and up and up as high as they thought it would be. It would still be going up, but it tapers off slightly. And the reason for that is that there is actually a change of behaviour, whereas beforehand throughout COVID we saw everyone, and I'll say everyone, in New South Wales and Victoria moving to Queensland, whereas now we're actually starting to see some reversal of people moving to Melbourne or people moving to Victoria or people moving to New South Wales, because in the recent times of property prices and also rental availability, we have a much tighter rental vacancy than Melbourne and New South Wales and Sydney. And so I have heard quite a lot of people saying, or I've actually decided to move out from the Gold Coast or move out from Brisbane because guess what? I'm actually finding a place that I can rent in Melbourne, or that a place that I can rent in regional New South Wales, or that I'm actually able to find a property to buy in regional New South Wales, not in Sydney. So I might be moving from Brisbane to regional New South Wales or regional Victoria, where there is still some similarities in the pricing, right? The Brisbane median price is about 900 on at the moment. Us, Gold Coast here is a bit higher, 950, 960. But they've chosen to move to regional Victoria like Bendigo or regional New South Wales like Tamworth, where the median house price is around 750. So, there are case studies where we are seeing some people starting to choose different places to live because we've become unaffordable to what it is that they can afford from a property and a lifestyle perspective. So we're yet to see this, what we call little distribution in data, because the way that the federal government, whether it's federal government, state, local council, the RBA, the way that they look at data is always as an aggregate, so always as a whole, right? And these small little distribution changes in the data has not fully translated into that aggregate whole that at the moment, a lot of the decisions that are being made is still at that very whole aggregate level. So once we start to see some of those changes starting to move through, then we might see some different sort of like decision making or some sort of like different approaches to things. But some of the case studies that we are seeing right now is definitely a change in pattern of where people are choosing to live.
Thank you, Asti. Well, thank you very much, Dave, for leading such an interesting discussion, and to all of our panellists, especially those who've come from far away. Dan McKenna's come from
far away.
I know, but
technically I'm
still
not
we
that
all
far
know
away.
it's pretty difficult getting from Brisbane to the Gold Coast in rush hour, so we do appreciate your coming all this way. And
Hang on, this one has come from
I know,
more
I
far
did
away.
start
This
by
one come
thanking
from
him,
Melbourne.
Dan.
Yeah.
We do
Okay.
appreciate your coming from Melbourne, and it's great to have you here, and it's been fascinating. And thank you to Dan, who's nearer to home. It's been very interesting. I'm sure you'd all like to join me in thanking the panel.